The discoveries of the past century have made Tyrannosaurus rex one of the most famous and the most fearsome of nature's creations. But how did such a ferocious giant come into being? Where does it fit in the history of life on Earth? Today, we know that T-Rex's ancestry can be traced back to a tiny creature whose skull can fit into the palm of your hand.
This is Eoraptor, or the dawn stealer. It's the oldest and first predatory dinosaur that we know of in the fossil record. And it has some of the basic adaptations that were to carry predatory dinosaurs through 150 million years of evolution to something like the Tyrannosaurus behind me. The skull shows some of the classic features of the predatory dinosaurs. One of those features involves the lower jaw. At the midpoint of the lower jaw, there's a joint that allowed the lower jaw to flex, like a flexible joint that if something was caught in the jaws, those jaws would clamp around something that might be a live prey item. And this kind of lower jaw is present in Tyrannosaurus. It's present in every other predatory dinosaur that we know of. And Eoraptor is the first to show that adaptation in the fossil record.
The body plan road-tested in Eoraptor became an evolutionary bestseller. Even today's birds, themselves thought to be modified dinosaurs, owe much of their design to these long-tailed ancestors. But how did T-Rex evolve from the size of a small dog into a 40-foot giant? For decades, many scientists thought it had to be descended from other giant predators like this Allosaurus, the last in a line of ever larger, ever toothier dinosaurs. This was the supercarnosaur hypothesis. It may have seemed obvious, but it was wrong.
We used to have very simple views about how the different groups of meat-eating dinosaurs were related to each other. In recent years, though, as we've discovered more and more about the anatomy, these views have changed. Tyrannosaurus at one time was considered to be a carnosaur, that is, one of the large meat-eating forms, and by its size, it was related to animals like Allosaurus. But in recent years, as we started to look more closely at the anatomy, there were a lot of things about Tyrannosaurs that did not fit that picture. One example is the foot. And if we look at this pinched out third toe, in fact, this is the kind of characteristic we see in many of the other late Cretaceous dinosaurs, but all of them are small dinosaurs. They're not these big meat eaters that we're so familiar with, animals like Allosaurus. Looking at the foot and a whole suite of other characters in the skeleton, we now realize that tyrannosaurs are in fact small meat-eating dinosaurs that have grown extremely large, and they're not related to the other meat-eating dinosaurs that are large at all.
Anatomical detective work can easily identify dinosaurs to whom T-Rex is not related. But tracing its family tree back through time is more difficult. A huge gap in the fossil record precedes the sudden appearance of T-Rex's first large predecessor. But recently, some of the missing clues have been found 4,000 feet up in the mountains of Alberta, Canada, on a prehistoric beach frozen in time, thrust on its side over millions of years.
The richest dinosaur footprint site in all of Canada is in a coal mine in Grande Cache, Alberta. In these 100-million-year-old rocks, we have evidence of armored dinosaurs, meat-eating dinosaurs of different kinds, and large plant-eating dinosaurs. The footprints are all in trackways, and they go across this enormous cliff face, which at one time must have been a mud flat at the edge of the sea. What's important about this site is that because of the age, 100 million years ago, we don't have equivalent bone sites in this part of the world. And so we have to do a little bit of guesswork in terms of identifying the dinosaurs. And I don't think there's any question at all that these are not tyrannosaur tracks. But their long, slender toes suggest to me that these were made by giant coelurosaurs. And we feel these days that giant coelurosaurs may have been the ancestor of Tyrannosaurus rex.
The coelurosaur was a turning point in the evolution of Tyrannosaurus rex. Unlike other small predators of its time, it used its jaws rather than its front limbs for killing its victims. That adaptation would set the stage for the rise of T-Rex and its unique appearance. The earliest of the Tyrannosaur family is called Electrosaurus. It is a long, slender animal with relatively long front limbs. By the time Albertosaurus evolved, its head was larger and its front limbs shorter.
There were certainly many species of tyrannosaurs. We, at present, know of more than half a dozen species. The earliest fossil record of Albertosaurus is about 80 million years old. This animal, in its external features, really isn't all that different from Tyrannosaurus rex, but when you start looking at specific characteristics, there are features which suggest it is more primitive than Tyrannosaurus rex itself.
But who was T-Rex's closest relative? Opinion is divided between two candidates. One from North America, known as Daspletosaurus, and another from Asia, known as Tarbosaurus.
Tarbosaurus is an animal that originally was called Tyrannosaurus as well. It has a number of differences, but when you start looking at other specifics, for example, the orientation of the back of the skull in relation to the neck, Tarbosaurus shows a lot of characters that suggest, to me at least, that it may be more closely related to Tyrannosaurus rex.
But a recent find from Montana convinces Jack Horner of T-Rex's American ancestry.
Daspletosaurus is the animal that I believe, and some others also believe, was actually the predecessor of Tyrannosaurus rex. In other words, its ancestor. Tyrannosaurus rex was the descendant of Daspletosaurus. Tyrannosaurs, they have a big horn over top of their eye, and we see it very dominant in Tyrannosaurus rex. We see it less dominant in this particular animal that is related to Daspletosaurus, and even less so in the more primitive Daspletosaurus.
The ancestry puzzle may take a long time to solve, but one trend is clear. As the Tyrannosaur family evolved, they not only grew larger, they changed to cope with their increased size.
There are a lot of changes that are necessary if you're going to become a large animal. And this is particularly true when we're talking animals like the meat-eating dinosaurs, because essentially they were teeter-totters. They were animals where the front of the body was balanced by the tail on a fulcrum, which was at the hips. Now, in Tyrannosaurus's case, as it got bigger, the head became disproportionately larger, and that's to house all those very large, vicious-looking teeth. Consequently, we see a lot of specializations in Tyrannosaurus that are meant to bring the body weight down in front of the hips. The skull is a long, heavy skull, but many of the bones, in fact, are air-filled. The neck has been recurved, much more so than in earlier meat-eating dinosaurs, simply because by doing that, it could bring the head back closer to the hips and shift the center of gravity further back as well. Finally, and probably most conspicuously, if you look at the front limbs of tyrannosaurs, they've become also extremely short. They were relying on their head to do the killing. The limbs could be shortened up and would give it a great savings in weight on the front end of the body. And it was one more of the adaptations that Tyrannosaurus picked up.
Ever since the first skeleton of T-Rex was assembled 80 years ago, most people have assumed that the king of dinosaurs must have been a slow and lumbering beast. But that view is changing.
From this position, one gets a sense of what an enormous animal Tyrannosaurus rex really is. In fact, this animal is so big and so massive that for a long time, everybody thought that this had to be a slow-moving animal. In recent years, though, we've been looking more closely at the anatomy of the hind leg of these dinosaurs. And what we see is not necessarily what we expected to see. The relative proportions of the individual leg bones of Tyrannosaurus give us an idea of how fast this animal could be. Now, in fast-moving animals like ostriches, the upper leg bone is relatively short compared to the lower leg bones. In Tyrannosaurus, we see the same kind of pattern. Lower bones are as long or longer than the upper bones. This continues, in fact, down into the foot, where if we look at the flat of the foot, or what would be the flat of the foot in a human being, this unit is also very long. All in all, then, if we look at the characters that we see in the hind legs of Tyrannosaurus, I don't think there's any question at all that in spite of its massive size, this is an animal that was built for speed, and it's an animal that, in fact, could outrun any of its potential prey in its world.
But Jack Horner has studied the same evidence and drawn the opposite conclusion. He is convinced that T-Rex was a walker, not a runner.
If we look at the leg bones of a meat-eating dinosaur named Troodon, what we see is a thigh bone and a shin bone that have different lengths. We see that the thigh bone is shorter than the shin bone. And this is true of every single one of the non-tyrannosaurs. We see the same thing in ostriches, we see the same thing in emus and rheas and all these running birds. Animals that run fast have a short thigh bone and a long shin bone. The primitive feature is running. That means in evolution, you have to evolve legs for walking because there were no dinosaurs that were adapted for walking before we get to the tyrannosaurs. If we look at tyrannosaurs, the thigh bone and the shin bone are either the same length or the thigh bone is slightly longer than the shin bone. This is a feature that is good for walking.
But the high plains of New Mexico may offer more direct evidence of exactly how fast T-Rex really moved. Martin Lockley follows the trail of fossilized footprints across North America. He has seen and cataloged thousands. But one footprint receives special treatment. It's so unique that its location is a tightly guarded secret.
We're inside a high-security area in the New Mexico backcountry. This fenced enclosure contains this extraordinary and unique fossil footprint. This is the only Tyrannosaurus footprint anywhere in the world. This footprint was probably made not far from some river in the mud, and then it was filled in when the river flooded and washed a sheet of sand over this trampled area. This is the casting that was filled in by sand, now sandstone. This track is on the order of 3 feet long, it's 2 feet wide, and it's almost a foot deep. This was made by an animal that probably weighed in at around 5 tons. It's sitting on a block that's about 9 feet long. There isn't a second footprint in that space, so that this means a minimum step of about 9 feet.